This episode of The Witch Wave is brought to you by the artist Amanda Bianco, who uses the magic of nature in her work. Amanda Bianco incorporates actual dye from flowers and the pattern of real tree rings in her products. And she generously sent me some of her artwork, and it is just so lovely and full of natural magic. You can invite these whimsical pieces into your sacred spaces by visiting www.amandabianco.com. That's Amanda, B as in bewitching, I-E-N as in nature, K-O.com. And use special offer code WITCH for 15% off your purchase. Thanks, Amanda. Today's episode of The Witch Wave is brought to you by Witch Baby Soap. Do you like to dwell in the shadows but stay squeaky clean? Then Witch Baby Soap is the soap for you. They make fabulous occult-themed body products like coffin-shaped bath balms, tarot card soap, and crystal-embedded body butters. Their recipes are made with magical intentions, and they're free of all of those nasty things like sulfates and parabens. And now you can get 15% off orders using offer code WITCHWAVE. That's WITCHWAVE, one word, on witchbabysoap.com. So get ready to wind down, lather up, and get some Witch Baby Soap products using offer code WITCHWAVE now.
The world is filled with bewitching people, and you might be one too. Welcome to the podcast where art is magic is real, and reality is stranger than dreams. I'm Pam Grossman, and this is The Witch Wave.
Hello and welcome to The Witch Wave. Tomorrow night is the full wolf moon, which always sounds to me like one of the gothest moons of the year. It's alleged that this moon gets its name because wolves are said to be heard howling in the heart of winter, whether due to hunger or territoriality. I love this moon because it reminds us to tap into our inner wildness. But for me, the full wolf moon also conjures images of werewolves and desolate landscapes and haunted houses. I've been listening obsessively to one of my favorite songs by the band TV on the Radio to get myself in the mood for this moon. It's called Wolf Like Me, and it begins with these lyrics. Say, my playmate, won't you lay hands on me, mirror my malady, transfer my tragedy? Got a curse I cannot lift, shines when the sunset shifts. When the moon is round and full, gotta bust that box, gotta gut that fish. The song then goes on to be this driving ode to animalistic, wolfish lust and frenzy and dark romance. And I confess, it totally tickles my inner gothling. I've also been thinking a lot about goth culture, where it comes from, why it persists, and what it can teach us about embracing darkness and loss and death in general. But certainly during this time of collective mourning and racial reckoning that we're going through right now here in America. We talk a lot on this show about how examining and integrating our shadow can help us become more healed and more whole. Doing that work makes us more potent witches and more compassionate people overall. And goth is one of those lenses through which we can look more closely at darkness, to learn from it, to welcome it, to celebrate it. So I think this gothy full wolf moon is the perfect backdrop for today's conversation with Leila Taylor, author of one of the best books I have read in years, called Darkly: Black History and America's Gothic Soul. Our conversation is lovely, dark, and deep, as the Robert Frost poem goes, and I can't wait for you to hear it. But before we get to that, first let's check and see what's come through on the Witch Wire.
Who is it?
Witches.
Hannah writes, I would like to say just how much I appreciate the insight and engagement of your podcast. I have been struggling with a certain question for a while, and I'm surprised it took me so long to think of asking you. I am a follower of Lilith. Even though I started my witchcraft practice certain that I would remain secular due to the religious traumas of my Catholic upbringing, I was soon drawn to the stories of Lilith and became fascinated by her rebellion and her resolve to be in the wilderness with her independence rather than be in the garden with her subservience. Shortly after I had reached out to a devotee online with questions, Lilith came to me in a vision. She appeared before me in a red cloak, and I heard her voice. You have asked for me, and here I am. I spent the following month in discernment and contemplation, and afterwards conducted a ritual of devotion to her as my patron. But in the years since, I have read conflicting ideas about whether Lilith is part of the closed culture of Judaism. To my knowledge, I have no Jewish ancestry, though admittedly the documented genealogy on my mother's side only goes back as far as the late 1800s. This has become a great struggle in my mind and my devotional practice. Your perspective as a person of Jewish heritage is very important to me, but equally important are your powers of nuance and reasoning. I am not asking to be coddled, but I have also realized that I cannot continue wholeheartedly in my devotion while this question hangs in my mind. Thank you, and may the new year bring blessings to you and your loved ones. Hi, Hannah. Well, the theme of today's episode is darkness, and I love talking about the dark goddess Lilith. But before I do, I think what you're asking about is a question that comes up a lot on this show, and that's, is it okay to have a relationship with a deity from a culture that is not yours? And I've had guests on this show from all different backgrounds who say yes, and I've had some guests of all different backgrounds who have said no. And so I'm afraid you're just not going to get a hard, fast rule around this. I sincerely wish there was a simple answer, but spirituality is not a simple topic. Now, as we know, and as you're getting at, cultural appropriation is absolutely a huge problem in the mystical community, especially when it comes to white people who borrow from African diaspora traditions or indigenous American traditions, and worst of all, who do so without awareness or sensitivity or consideration of the painful histories and dynamics that exist there. So I think when approaching a deity from a culture that isn't yours, doing a lot of research and giving credit to the communities of origin is absolutely crucial. I also think that profiting off of these communities and not paying them or otherwise consensually collaborating with them is not okay, just as a rule of thumb. And I think you should also consider that no matter how much due diligence you do, you might still upset or hurt someone in those communities because no group is a monolith and has a single spokesperson for everyone in that group, right? So just because a bunch of people from a certain group might green light something, that doesn't mean you might not encounter someone else who is of that group who isn't that pleased with what you're doing. And that's just something to keep in mind. And so there's not a permission slip or a certificate that you can get from these different groups, other than potentially converting outright to be a religious member of some of them. And even then you might convert, and then there will be people who might say, oh, but you're not really an XYZ because your ancestors aren't from this group, right? So it's just something to keep in mind that there may always be naysayers, but I think there are ways that you can be as respectful as possible when approaching material that is outside your own lineage. Okay, so all of that said, I personally, and I'm speaking just for myself, and I reserve the right to evolve this thinking, but I personally currently do not think that we must only stick to our own culture or cultures of origin when it comes to our spirituality. Music, food, fashion, art, and yes, spirituality cross-pollinates and travels and intermingles. And I think that's something that at its best is so beautiful and inspirational. On the other hand, whitewashing something and calling it your own when it's not is not okay. So giving credit and respect and, yes, funding to the culture of origin when appropriate is crucial. And also just acknowledging and knowing that there are deep histories and complicated contexts that you don't have access to is an important thing to examine as well. You just don't have that lived experience. You don't have that, cultural nuance that comes with someone who has been brought up in a certain community, right? So I'm sure I don't have to say this to you, but just so we're clear, working with Lilith doesn't make you Jewish, and feeling a kinship with her doesn't give you a full understanding of what it means to be a Jew. But in sum, yes, I'm Jewish, I'm a Jewitch, and you are not Jewish, and you love Lilith. And frankly, I think that's really lovely. I probably wouldn't go around calling yourself a Jewish priestess of Lilith anytime soon, and I don't think you're planning on doing that. But I absolutely believe that this goddess has messages and inspiration for you, and that you owe it to yourself to learn more about her. I'll also add that in this case, Lilith is kind of an exceptional character because she's very much part of Jewish folklore, but she's not really in the Torah or a part of Jewish worship in the traditional sense. In fact, ancient Jews were terrified of her and believed she would kill their newborn children, and so they used lots of amulets and incantation bowls to protect their homes from her. Lilith was no joke. She was a demoness, according to their thinking. That story of Lilith being Adam's first wife didn't get popularized until the 8th century CE, thanks to another book whose title translates to The Alphabet of Ben Sirah. And she's probably a permutation of much older Mesopotamian storm goddesses called the Lilitu. And quick plug, I do write about Lilith in my book, Waking the Witch, so you might want to check that out too. Anyhow, my point is there's no real crisp history of Jews worshiping Lilith as part of our religion. She's much more of a mythical being, like a bogey woman, and it's only been within the last 50 or so years that feminists reframed her as this awesome, witchy, rebellious inspiration. And I still think that that interpretation of her has validity and majesty and truth. Deities morph and their magic and meanings mutate all the time. All of this to say, though, that to my mind, working with Lilith is different than if you wanted to form a relationship with a deity that is still an active part of an active religion. So I think you get a little more leeway in this case. Anyway, that's just my 2 cents. I'm sure there might be some Jewitches out there or just straight up Jewish people who might feel differently than me, so you should know that. But I don't feel offended by this, and I think learning more about her and deepening your relationship with her respectfully and mindfully sounds like a beautiful idea. So thank you so much for your considerate question, and tell my girl Lilith I say hey. Now, on to my guest. Leila Taylor is the author of Darkly, Black History and America's Gothic Soul, and I am head over heels in love with this book. It opened my mind and my heart and made so many connections for me. And it's so smart and beautifully written and deeply insightful. And you will hear me gushing even more about it in my conversation with Leila in a moment. Leila is a writer and designer whose work overall is focused on the Gothic and Black culture, horror, and the aesthetics of melancholy. She's been published in the Journal of Horror Studies, the New Urban Gothic, Dispatches from the Institute of Incoherent Geography, and the Repeater Book of the Occult. She has given talks for the International Gothic Association in Mexico and the UK, and here in New York at Morbid Anatomy. Leila received a Master's in Fine Arts from Yale University and an MA in Liberal Studies at the New School for Social Research. If all that wasn't dreamy enough, she also happens to be creative director for the Brooklyn Public Library. Leila joined me from her home in Brooklyn via Zoom. Leila Taylor, welcome to the Witch Wave.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm very excited. I'm very honored to be here.
I am so thrilled to have you here. As I've told you before, I am just such a fangirl of yours, so this is a true treat. And your book, Darkly, Black History and America's Gothic Soul, I'm not exaggerating when I say, like, it is one of my favorite books that I've read in the last, however long it's been out. Is it 2 years-ish now? Yeah. And I've bought it for people. Like, I just love this book so much. So let's talk about, just by way of introduction, how it seems like you were literally born to write this book. The intersections of all of your biographical details just make you the person to write about it. Can you share a little bit about why you think that may or may not be true yourself?
Yeah. I mean, it's funny because my name is Leila, which means dark as night or beautiful as the night or something like that in Arabic. So I feel like it was just sort of, I was made to be talking about dark and spooky things. You know, we moved around a lot when I was a kid, but some formative years were in Detroit, which is a majority Black city. And, I went to kind of a hippie Quaker school. My mom's an anthropologist and my dad's an architect. My friends, the people I was surrounded by were super, super, super diverse. And then my sophomore year in high school, we moved to Cincinnati, Ohio. And that was just like a complete 180, all of a sudden there was this really big divide between white kids and the black kids. I didn't see any like weird black kids the way I did in Detroit. I was suddenly kind of the only one in the room, and that was kind of my first realization that my blackness was somehow different from other people's blackness.
In what way?
In Detroit, there was like, I'd be in a classroom with majority of black kids, and you'd have your nerdy black kids and your jock black kids and your, black kids in the sci-fi. And then you had your like gothy black kids and your arty farty black kids. So there was this spectrum of personality, right? And when I went into a much more kind of segregated space, it was like everybody was listening to the same music. Everyone was kind of dressed in the same way. And it could have been, just the nature of that particular school or whatever. But when I was like hanging out in the art room or going to arty farty movies, downtown, is with all the white kids. So that was when I really started feeling like, as I say, the only raisin in the oatmeal. Like I'm the only black face in here. Yeah. And as I started getting older and going to shows and going to concerts and stuff, and even much, much older, like, maybe 10 years ago when I started going to, lectures and talks about all sorts of spooky, macabre things or, art shows or what have you. And I'd look around and I'd be like, I'm the only black person here, or like there'd be one other person, and, and I thought, well, why is that, and I started off wanting to look at sort of black folks in the goth scene, I basically kind of narrow it down to my own experience and the thing that I loved. And what was it like being kind of twice marginalized, you know?
It's like this double otherness.
Yeah, exactly. But what I found was, like black goth, the same as white goth people, you know what I mean? It's like, we all like the same stuff and the same kind of music and dress the same. But the difference is that you're a black person in America. So your experience in the world is different in a way that non-black people don't experience, whether you're goth or not,
Absolutely. Do you remember what got you into goth music? Like, what was the gateway drug for you, if you will?
Detroit had a really great radio station, like alternative radio station. And my best friend was a little more into music than I was. Like she was like a smidge more of ahead of the curve. We'd go to record stores together and we would feel like a million years old. I'm talking about like radio stations and record stores. But
I love it.
So maybe around like 13 years old, I was super into like Anne Rice and vampires and the macabre and the occult. And then at some point I heard Susie and the Banshees. And it kind of led to The Cure and Bauhaus. And I was like, this is it. This music is it. So the music just kind of fit my personality, I mean, because I was so young, it's not like I was going to clubs or anything.
Sure.
So the culture, like goth culture, I wasn't so much a part of at that young age. It was really, really about the music.
Yeah.
And me trying to dress like Susie Sue as best as I could.
Yes. Oh my God. I want to see pictures. That's so rad. I just want to make sure that those who are listening have the basic definitions down, just so we all know what we're talking about here. I mean, I do think, what's that cliche? Like, when you look at porn, it's hard to define, but you know it when you see it. Like it's right. Exactly. And it's kind of like that with goth a little bit. But how do you define goth? How do you describe it to people?
Well, and this kind of brings the book into a little bit because I talk about the gothic more in the book. So there's goth and gothic, which are two totally different things. So goth is a music genre that started out of England in the late 70s with Joy Division. And then Susie and the Banshees and Bauhaus and The Cure came along as a kind of foundational bands. And through that, the subculture, the people who love the music grew out around that. And because of like Susie Sue and Robert Smith, it's post-punk really. So there's some punk influence there. So this style, this fashion, this look kind of got associated with goth music, and it became sort of this whole bigger thing. And the thing is, it changes a lot. Like what goth is to me, like as a 48-year-old, is probably not the same as it is for, a 15-year-old now, like it's a very malleable genre, and it kind of changes and morphs depending on the time,
Sure.
But that's goth.
Yes. And there are signifiers that seem to kind of be a through line through it all, though. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Black.
Yep.
Wearing all black.
Yep.
That's like the basic foundational thing.
For sure.
There's a aesthetic that kind of borrows from Victorian morning drag, fetish gear, punk stuff. It's moved into sort of more cyber stuff over the years. It kind of changes to kind of vamp stuff. The intricacies of the look kind of changes, but it's always, I'd say, a little bit over the top.
Yep.
Always all black. I would say drama is the key line.
Yes.
Through it. Like it's not one ring on your finger. It's like a ring on every finger,
I'm going to quote you to you. You have this great line in the book. You say that when you describe gothness, you say to people, picture a peacock. Now imagine a peacock that's all black. And I love that so much because it speaks to, there's a bit of like a flamboyance and kind of a campness. Wouldn't you agree?
Oh, totally. The reason why I picked the peacock too is that it's ridiculous. That big, huge tail, it's all drama. It's all show. It's sort of gorgeous and excessive,
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's this misconception that goth is all about doom and gloom, when really it's about like the performance of doom and gloom.
Yes.
And it's about romanticizing, melancholy and romanticizing these things. So there is this definite fun and a little bit of frivolity and a little bit of whimsy. I love the word whimsy when I describe goth because people don't think of it that way, but it's true. If you're walking around with a black velvet top hat and a parasol in the middle of summer, that's not a very like serious, stuffy person,
Exactly.
It's romanticism, really.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so you were going to tell us, how's that related to kind of gothic, like the gothic, art movement or gothic movements in history?
So while goth is a music genre and a subculture and a fashion, gothic is really a descriptor that has its origins when the Visigoths sacked Rome in the 5th century, right? During the Age of Enlightenment, the term gothic kind of came back to be associated with things that were kind of wild and unsophisticated and irrational, since the Goths trashed Rome, and Rome was all about classical antiquity and stuff and logic and reason. So that term gothic kind of got associated things which were kind of unsophisticated and kind of trashy. And then kind of around like the Middle Ages up until 18th century or so, Gothic architecture, or the term Gothic, was applied to a kind of architecture that was tons of spiky stuff, sharp, incredibly elaborate spiky stuff everywhere, spiky pointy things.
Yes, I love it.
Over the top detail for everything, right? Gothic was also used to describe a kind of post-Reformation, British political party and things like that. There's a type style called Gothic that doesn't look Gothic at all. But like the way that kind of we think of Gothic, well, it started in 1764 with the author Horace Walpole, who wrote The Castle of Otranto. And that's considered the first Gothic novel. And that has, it takes place in the Middle Ages. There's a big sort of medieval revivalism about Gothic. It's a creepy, decrepit castle. There are ghosts. It's all about superstition. And then Frankenstein came along, and you can go up the scale. But when we think of Gothic stuff, that's kind of what we're thinking of,
Yes.
So now it's become kind of this catch-all signifier for anything that's kind of dark or creepy or macabre or the sublime. And it's also romanticism. It's kind of dark romanticism. So Wuthering Heights is considered Gothic, but like Alexander McQueen's clothes could be considered Gothic,
Absolutely. For me, I would consider myself, when I was in high school, I came of age in the 90s. I was a teenager, and I would consider myself goth adjacent. Like, I loved The Cure. I loved Susie Sue. At the time, like, Marilyn Manson was, all the rage. And then listeners are sick of hearing me talk about like PJ Harvey and Bjork and Tori, which are not goth, but I would almost consider them like goth adjacent in terms of that dark romanticism and stuff.
Yeah. Oh, PJ Harvey. Yeah.
A little bit, maybe.
That's really interesting. Yeah.
But it's interesting talking to you about it and hearing the words that come up for you, because I was expecting you to talk about like decay and death and that's a big piece of it, I think, for some folks as well.
Oh yeah.
But I love all the romanticism and the beauty and those words that you're using too, because that's absolutely it. It's not depressing.
Yeah, but also like the ruin is a huge part of it, and decay and things like that. But it's finding the beauty in that ruin, and kind of loving that aesthetic and the memento mori-ness of decay, of the cemetery. All of that is definitely part of it. And a lot of it is that sort of reminder we are going to die someday.
Yes. Yes. So I want to get back to this notion of like that double otherness you were contending with, because, when you were talking about the origin of goth music, like it's a lot of white people, and it's a lot of people who, the stereotype of the goth is someone with like ultra pale skin. And you write in the book really sensitively about how like you had to kind of reconcile that and feel like you as a Black person absolutely had validity and were welcome, or at least, felt like you had a right to be part of this subculture. And I was trying to parse, it sounds like a lot of your Black peers were making you feel othered. Did you feel othered by white folks in the goth community, or was it more just that internalized feeling of like being the raisin in the oatmeal?
It was more my own folks. It was more Black folks. I got called Oreo a lot, like black on the outside, white on the inside. I got accused of like trying to be white or like trying to act white or whatever. And it was so hurtful and so infuriating, because it wasn't true. I wasn't trying to be white, and the idea that, people were saying or thinking that there was this kind of quantitative scale of how Black you were based on the clothes you wore or the music you liked or the things that you did, that how that somehow made you more Black than someone who, likes Depeche Mode or whatever.
Sure.
So the idea that there was this restriction or this limitation of what the expression of what a Black person is was bullshit to me forever. Pardon my, language.
We curse like pirates on the Witch Wave.
Oh, good.
Yes, bring it on.
Yeah, so it angered me a lot because it was one of those things where it's like, one, you don't know me, and two, why are you trying to define what a Black person is? That's what the society has done for 400 years, is try to say Black people are this, Black people are that. Why do that to ourselves?
Yeah. What I love about this book, there's so much, but you so masterfully really make the case that gothness and blackness, especially the Black American experience, and I'm saying that in quotes because I know there's no one monolithic experience, but that they actually have so much in common. You write, both goth and blackness are performative identities with foundations in transgression, a familiarity with death and aestheticized mourning, and a keen awareness of the darker side of human nature. And while I think goths do contend with those broader themes of like death and decay and suffering and hauntedness, which we could argue is universal, Black American history, I don't have to tell you, has tragically interfaced with those horrors in these like really specific, non-hypothetical ways. And we're going to get into some of that. But I was wondering if unpacking gothness has made you feel like you have like more ownership over or further affirmation of your goth identity as a Black person. Like, yeah.
One of the bigger differences in all of this is, like you said, a lot of the real horror and mourning and sorrow and pain and anger and frustration, all of the sort of negative emotions that the Gothic kind of deals with, is so much a part of the historical lived experience of Black people in America. You know, it's generational. It's a sort of generational trauma. It's built into it, you know. And again, goth music, you know, came from post-punk, which came from punk, which came from rock, and the blues, which came from Black music.
Yep.
All of this came from Black music, you know. But I do think that there is this, and I'm going to say Gothic more than goth, because I think goth kind of limits it, at least in my head, it limits it to the music and the clothes, when the Gothic is really a much, much, much bigger, broader aesthetic that can be applied to all sorts of things. So I do think that the experience of living with this kind of systemic and consistent melancholy, and I don't mean that Black people are walking around in tears all the time, but I mean that there is this significant loss, this lack of all of those people who were lost in the transatlantic slave trade, the loss of languages, the loss of histories, the loss of traditions, the separation of families, and then sort of being told of being split up and being codified in this country. So much of identity and so much of who we were has been policed, has been dictated, you know, has tried to be made into something that it's not. So all that stuff, all of the frustration in that, and all of that gaslighting, it's like 400 years of freaking being gaslit in this country.
Yeah.
All of that has to go somewhere. And I think it goes into art. I think it goes into music and literature, in clothes, in film. And I think also the bigger part of it is that Black people, because of this history and because of our lived experience up to this day, we don't have the option of looking at the world as a perfect, beautiful, shiny, happy place. We don't have the luxury of looking at America as that shining city on the hill.
Sure.
Because we've seen behind the curtain, you know, we lived behind the curtain. So part of goth and the Gothic is kind of looking into the abyss, you know, and the abyss looking back at you.
Yes.
And that is part of the Black, like when all of this shit went down on the 6th, didn't surprise Black people at all. No one was surprised.
Exactly.
You're like, yep.
The Capitol riots you're talking about. Yep.
Yeah. Again, it's part of the sort of double consciousness thing that the experience that non-Black people have in this country is different from the experience that Black people have in this country. And I should also put a little asterisk on there saying, say most marginalized people, Native Americans, queer people, Latino people, people from the Middle East, any of these marginalized groups, that have been sort of stereotyped and limited and restricted, they all have a gothicness to them too.
Yes.
That's all there. It may not be any movies about it yet, but there will be. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. On that note, we're going to take a quick break and we'll be right back.
Look, it's hard enough grappling with our own emotions under ordinary circumstances, but even more so when the world is going through massive collective challenges. I am so grateful for my therapist, and even though I've done sessions in person for years, I've been pretty amazed at how effective online therapy has been for me right now. And so I can heartily recommend BetterHelp, an online counseling service which can provide you with your own licensed professional therapist to talk to via video or phone sessions. So if you have anxiety issues like I do, or are dealing with depression, stress, trauma, grief, or even just day-to-day struggles with your relationships or your family, or just feeling like you're not meeting your personal goals right now, which, let's be honest, has been very difficult for most of us these days, I really encourage you to reach out to the folks at BetterHelp. They will connect you with a counselor that you can start chatting with in under 24 hours. Now, a few things I really appreciate about BetterHelp is that it's more affordable than traditional offline counseling. Plus, they offer financial aid to those who qualify, and they make it super easy to change counselors so you can find one that you really click with. Best of all, Witchwave listeners, that's you, get 10% off your first month of counseling by going to betterhelp.com/witchwave. That's better, HELP.com/witchwave. I believe that all human beings can benefit from therapy. I certainly have myself, and I'm so glad that it's becoming more accepted and more accessible to do so. So please pop over to betterhelp.com/witchwave and find a great counselor to talk to. BetterHelp is confidential, convenient care, and you, my friend, deserve that. Would you like even more Witchwave? Then come join us on Patreon, where you'll get bi-weekly bonus Witchwave Plus episodes, ad-free Witchwave episodes, and detailed show notes for all. Rewards also include magical merch and giveaways, early heads up about my workshops before they sell out, and all backers get access to our exclusive digital coven, where I lead monthly rituals and video chats, and where you can connect to a community of other wonderful witches. So head on over to patreon.com/witchwave and sign up. It's a fabulous way to get more magic in your life and to support the show. Thanks so much.
Welcome back to the Witch Wave. Today I'm speaking with Leila Taylor. So Leila, one of the things I love in this book is the way that you connect the goth adjacent genre of horror to Blackness. And of course, we've seen a lot more of that being done recently through films like Jordan Peele's Get Out and Us and the HBO series Lovecraft Country. But I was especially moved by your analysis of American ghost stories, from Edgar Allan Poe's tales to Toni Morrison's Beloved. And to actually get to a point you were just making before the break, you write, America is built over the bones of brown people who were here first and built by Black people who were brought here against their will, and the fear of retaliation is real. So first, actually, I want to ask you about, you talk about the telltale heart as kind of this wonderful, very American story, and one that you think speaks to a lot of our history, the hauntedness of America. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, Poe is really into hiding things in walls and under floorboards and things like that. And the idea of the skeleton in the closet, essentially, sin, the evil, the murder that you committed, hiding that body in a wall or under a floorboard and things like that, where you live, like that ghost, you put that ghost there and it's with you all the time. And you're kind of doing your best to pretend it's not there and forget about it. But you put it there. You put it there and it's going to knock on your door and your walls, whether you like it or not. So I think the idea of this fear of your sins coming back at you, of your chickens coming home to roost, is still here. It's still here. There's still a fear that if Black folks get into power, we're going to immediately start, making slaves out of all white people, out of,
to retaliate.
Something, or retaliation or something like that. Because it's guilt. All of it is this deep, deep repressed guilt. Because they knew they were doing wrong and they still know they're doing wrong. And they know that they've gotten away with murder. And that's what it is. And they know there's always going to be, looking over your shoulder, waiting for that, knock in the wall because they're guilty.
Yeah. Yes. It made me think about how in Stephen King novels, like, there's that trope of like the Indian burial ground too. Just like the many, many sins and murderous horrors that this country has been founded on, and that we continue, I'll say we as white people, the white we has continued to keep buried in the walls and keep oppressed and pushed down in literal and figurative ways.
Yeah.
I was curious how you yourself literally or figuratively think about these ghosts, because you have this one moment in the book where you talk about seeing a phantom dog as a child. And so I got curious, Leila. I'm like, how much do you think ghosts and the ghosts of our dead are still with us? Or do you think that horror is just a way that we're reconciling with this from like a psychological, mythopoetic standpoint?
I think it's both. I want to believe, I think there is this metaphor of the ghost as a remnant of the past that's here in the present, right? And I do think that spaces absorb energy. I do believe that places, that things, particularly houses, I'm fascinated by haunted houses. I do think that material can maybe take in some of the things around them. And if there's something that's particularly violent or horrifying or something, maybe that imprint or whatever is a little bit stronger or something. But then there's also this idea. First of all, I feel like there's these different definitions or ideas of a ghost. There's the trace of something left behind. But then also, I have this idea of the ghost as being temporal, that it's sort of, you're kind of, the past and the present have somehow overlapped or happening at the same time, like my present is the ghost present, where it just happened to be there at the same time when it normally wouldn't. Or the one that makes me the saddest is the idea of, the spirit or the essence of someone getting stuck here, being stuck, in this plane, or being stuck in this existence because of the horrible way they left, or leaving something unresolved or unfinished. So they kind of can't move on, And I think the sort of American experiment of all this applies to all of those things. We are very much living in the past and the present. We're very much seeing the remnants of slavery to this day in all of its many forms, like the for-profit prison industrial complex. It's basically slavery.
Absolutely.
But again, there's a lot of this psychic and spiritual unfinished business, It's funny because people ask me if I believe in ghosts, and I think it depends on what your definition of a ghost is. I don't think there's one particular definition of what a ghost is. I mean, the way I guess I would think of it is that do these traces, do these temporal moments leave behind something material? Is it possible that these essence or this energy can affect physics, can affect our physical space, in a way that we can actually sense, either taste or smell or hear or feel or whatever, How strong does that trace or that spirit or that whatever have to be to be visible or have sound or have smell or whatever? Mm-hmm. That was my very long answer. I think my short answer is, yeah, I do believe in ghosts of some kind. Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of my witchy friends, they keep talking about how when Trump leaves the White House, they just want to burn all the herbs and just do all the rituals and kind of they're being cheeky and also not cheeky.
Yeah.
And it got me thinking about, I absolutely believe that reparations should be paid to Black Americans. And of course, I think money and support and resources in the material sense absolutely should be reallocated in that way. But I'm also I wonder what the ceremonies are and the spiritual healing that we need to do as a nation too. I don't have an answer, but I just wonder what that might look like too.
Yeah, I think whatever that is, and I think the museum that opened up, the lynching museum, is kind of touching on that or trying to touch on that. I think whatever that is going to be really, really important, because the monetary value, the economic, the capital value of that loss, God knows what that is. I do not know what that is because it's invaluable. It's repaid in access to healthcare. It's repaid in, equitable education experience. It's in housing opportunities. It can be repaid in that way and investing into Black communities. But the spiritual damage, I'm interested in that too. I'm curious as to what that really looks like, because there's memorials and there's tributes kind of all over the place to slavery and to the civil rights movement and things like that. There's the African American Museum in DC that opened up not that long ago. Yeah, I feel like there needs to be something much bigger, and I don't know what that is either.
Yeah. Well, it's certainly worth considering and dreaming about. We have lots of magical people who listen to this show, so just putting that out in the ether to whomever's listening. I want to pivot ever so slightly. This is the witch wave, and so I need to ask you about witches, because there are so many more witch stories on screen and in books than ever before. And still, so often those witches are depicted as white, or if they're Black, they're shown as a very offensive kind of caricature of the voodoo priestess, which is pretty clumsy and very racist. I was wondering if you had any thoughts on depictions of Black witches in fiction, things you'd like to see more of, less of, anything that you think is being done well.
I was thinking about this, and I love American Horror Story. I do. And I love the Coven series, but the way that they talk about voodoo just makes my skin crawl. They always refer to it as being something kind of low or trashy or it's always kind of poo-pooed as not being as good as the white people, white witches, whatever. But there's a web series called Juju that's about 4 Black women in New York City who discover that they're witches. And I really want this to get picked up somewhere. I would love to see more contemporary depictions of witches and voodoo and the way people actually really live with it, especially voodoo or hoodoo, because I personally actually don't know that much about it. Or my knowledge is pretty surface compared to people who actually practice it, So I would love to see something more about people right here and now, not something in the past, and not something, but how people practice and incorporate it into their everyday lives, in their studios in Brooklyn,
Yes, absolutely. And it's happening. I mean, my coven is really diverse, and we have several Black witches who are incorporating all their like African diaspora traditions into, the more, I guess you would call it, Wicca influenced, that kind of style of witchcraft, and how it's being blended together is so moving and beautiful. I'd love to see that on screen too.
Yeah. And then just the one thing I was thinking about this, and I was thinking about the first time I saw a Black witch or depiction of that, and it was The Wiz. The movie The Wiz.
Yes.
And I was just like, oh my God, Lena Horne as Glenda, and Miss One as the Witch of the North. I forget the directions the witches are. Even like Eveline. Those are 3 Black witches.
Yes.
And they were all fantastic. They're all actually and the great music, and they were all different from each other. And so I think my first sort of thinking of what a Black witch was probably Lena Horne as Glenda in The Wiz.
I mean, it doesn't get much better than her, though, does it? That's gorgeous. I just watched that recently, like maybe within the past year and a half, and that gown. She's yeah.
Makes me cry. That in song every time makes me cry.
So beautiful. On that note, we're going to take another quick break, and we'll be right back.
I absolutely adore Zoo's incense. Zoo's incense is a handmade, hand-rolled, all-natural product. All of their ingredients are organic or wild-crafted, which means they're made with whole plants, seeds, roots, woods, tree resins, and tinctures. Zoo's has 9 blends currently available, and they are so magical. And I am so thrilled that I have collaborated with them to create the Witch Wave Blend, which is inspired by Artemis. It contains sandalwood, orris root, myrrh, black storax, mugwort, ambret seed tincture, and organic ylang-ylang essential oil. And you can find that special exclusive Witch Wave blend over on the Witch Wave website in our shop by going to witchwavepodcast.com/shop. So do check out the Witch Wave incense blend from Zoo's. In addition to all of that, Zoo's is now offering incense making kits for your own incense crafting experiments at home. You can look for exclusive new incense crafting supplies on the Zoo's website, alongside their other hand-cast concrete burners, charcoal, raw aromatics like frankincense and myrrh, and other incense supplies. You can find all of that over on the Zoo's website, which is zoozincense.com. That's ZOUZ incense.com. And you can get free shipping on orders over $22 by using code WitchWave. So just to repeat all of this juicy information, you can find the Witchwave exclusive incense blend over on the Witchwave website at witchwavepodcast.com/shop. And you can also get all of those other wonderful incense goodies at zoozincense.com and get free shipping on orders over $22 by using promo code WitchWave. That's zoozincense.com, promo code WitchWave. Thank you, Zoos.
Welcome back to the Witch Wave. Today I'm speaking with Leila Taylor. So Leila, we were just speaking about witches and spell casting. And I really, really adored how you wrote about the song I Put a Spell on You in Darkly, and about the musician Screamin' Jay Hawkins in general. And I found it really eye-opening when I was reading this. And I'm just going to confess, I have loved him since I was a teenager. My ringtone to this day is his version of that song. I've had that same ringtone for, I think maybe 15 years. And I've always enjoyed him as this very campy, I know I'm being kind of anachronistic here, but Elvira kind of character. He's a very cartoonish pop occult performer. And I just think he has a great voice and on and on and on. So I love him, right?
Yeah.
But after reading your book, I'm like, oh shit, is my love of him even okay? I mean, I had no idea he had that album, Black Music for White People. I had no idea there was this perception of him as really performing Blackness in this very problematic way. And so I would just love for you to walk us through your thinking around him.
Keep loving him. Keep loving him, because I have come to love him too. And I think because when I first saw him, without really knowing anything about him, I have no idea how old it was, it always kind of made me cringe because it felt to me this kind of minstrelly depiction of the quote unquote like jungle man with the bone through his nose and the kind of ooga booga, I got a stick with a skull on it.
Yeah.
So it felt like all of those movies from like the 40s or whatever that were mocking Black people. And it felt like it was this caricature of that for white audiences. I mean, he knew exactly what he was doing, right? Like, I love the idea, like he used to rise out of a coffin, on stage. And I think it was like a radio person's guy or someone suggested that he do that. And he was like, I'll do that if you pay me more.
Yes.
He got extra money to do the rising out of the coffin stick, Yeah. And I was watching videos of him, and there are moments where like he's almost starting to laugh a little bit in performances because he knows that he's playing on this old fear of the Black person as the scary
other,
voodoo jungle other man or something like that. And he's playing off of that, and he knows that. The thing that got a little sad for me about learning about him is that it kind of wasn't what he wanted in the beginning. He wanted to be an opera singer. He wanted to be like a crooner. And he kind of got stuck in this gimmick that was really hard for him to get out of, So in that note, that is like, oh, he wanted to do more than just that. And I think he probably wanted to be seen as more than just that. So he kind of got stuck in this character. But he knew what he was doing with that character. And that's exactly it. The album called Black Music for White People is exactly what he was doing.
Yeah.
So knowing what he was doing and knowing how he was playing with that and playing with audiences, it makes me just kind of love him even more. Like, he was not a victim of this.
Yeah, he had agency.
He had agency in this.
Did he write his music too? I forget if you touch on that in the book.
Yeah. I don't know if he wrote everything.
And I didn't realize, though, that he, at least in this one anecdote that you share in the book, he did at least seem to practice some form of hoodoo, we'll call it.
Yeah.
Can you tell that story?
Yeah, there's this great documentary about him. So he was in Jim Jarmusch's movie, Mystery Train, like kind of cameo. He was the hotel clerk. And Jim Jarmusch tells a story about how they were trying to shoot something and it was raining and raining and raining, and they were afraid they were going to be delayed or go over budget or something. And he always carried a bag of bones, a little kind of bag. And he tossed them out and he looked at them and he was like, don't worry about it. Keep working. It's fine. It's not going to rain. And it didn't rain. So for some reason.
Yes.
And Jarmusch said that he would say that he practiced hoodoo, but no one really knew for sure. They didn't know if it was an act or if it was legit or whatever. But Jim Jarmusch was like, well, it didn't rain, so maybe.
Exactly. I love that. I love that. So speaking of music, obviously goth music is like a huge drumbeat throughout this book, if you'll pardon the pun. And I know that you grew up loving the Smiths, and it is so fucking cool that you got to see them live. Amazing. And of course, Susie and the Banshees and The Cure and on and on. But later in the book, you parse through older Black American music, particularly the song Strange Fruit. And many listeners will know this song most famously performed by Billie Holiday. And I learned actually on NPR a couple years ago, they did some kind of special where they talked about the origin of that song, how it was written by a Jewish dude named, am I pronouncing this right? Abel
Mirapol, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Communist, very, very heavy in the Communist Party. He was a radical.
Exactly. And his pen name, we should say, was Lewis Allen, if people are confused by who we're talking about. As many know, this is such a gorgeous song, but it's a horrific song about lynching. And you confess that you yourself might have heard this song first through the Susie and the Banshees cover of it, and how now that version doesn't sit so well with you. And I know I talk about Tori way too much on this podcast, but that's, that was the cover version I was familiar with, is like Tori Amos like crooning Strange Fruit on the piano. And now I'm like, ooh, that doesn't sit so well with me either. So I was just wondering if delving more into the history of Black America and Black American music, if it's made you look at these white artists that you love more critically, and if there's loss to that at all.
Yeah, it has. But also my feeling is if you really, really love something, you criticize it, you nitpick it, and you get into the weeds of it because you love it. Like if I didn't really like Susie and the Banshees, if I thought they were mediocre, I wouldn't have been thinking about this much. You know what I mean?
Yes.
And it's the fact that I love their music so much, which made me look at that song in such a different way than I was when I was a kid, I mean, it's funny you mentioned the Smiths because, fucking Morrissey, like I used to idolize him. And I think with Susie and the Banshees version, I don't think it was part of some grand ideological thing that she sung in the song. I think it really kind of fits her genre and it fits her style. And I think when I first heard it, I was like, yeah, this sounds like a Susie and the Banshees cover because, it has a sort of very visceral quality to it and visceral language to it that's very grotesque, but at the same time, musically very lovely and kind of romantic, so it kind of fits her stylistically, but the song itself is so thick and heavy with history, even to this day, it kind of gives me chills listening to it, And I'm not saying that only Black people should sing Strange Fruit. Anyone can sing Strange Fruit if they want to, I don't care, but you gotta kind of acknowledge where it came from, and you kind of have to. I think if you're not a Black person in America or a marginalized or someone who has dealt with that particular kind of violence, state-sanctioned violence, it's hard to pull off because I think it can really feel just like a surface homage or something as opposed to actually feeling it. Susie and the Banshees is still one of my favorite bands. I listen to their music all the time still. But her version kind of makes me cringe a little bit. I'm like, oh, Susie.
Yes, I know. You write a lot about some Black artists who are now weaving gothicness or goth culture into their music in such inventive and gorgeous ways. I admit I had never heard of M. Lamar, for example, the artist that you write about. Can you tell us about their work a little bit?
I discovered him through an article in the New York Times. I think I literally had Googled just like Black Goth or something. And he's a musician and performer, the video installations. And his music is actually a little bit closer to opera. He sings that kind of that high
falsetto.
Yeah, I think there's a better term for that I can't remember at the top of my head. Very like Leontine Price, like he kind of channeling a lot of sort of these Black opera singers. A little bit Diamanda Gallis. A lot of.
I was literally about to bring her name up.
Yeah. So he kind of borrows from old Negro spirituals. He talks about slavery explicitly in his music and in his videos. And he talks about the trauma and the lingering trauma and that lingering melancholy bucolic state left behind from slavery. That's what he talks about in his music. But the music itself, when you've heard it, you probably wouldn't think, oh, that's a goth band, because it's so operatic. And there's a little bit of death metal in there too, you know? So I think as his musically, I think he kind of defies genre a little bit. But because of that, I think he sort of perfectly embodies Black gothness.
Yes, yes. We had this wonderful rapper from South Africa named Eugen Blackrock on the show last season, and she has a whole album where she is rapping about like being an astro goth. And I really love seeing the goth genre be reclaimed in a way by Black artists, because to your point, it all circles back to Black music in the first place. So I find that really exciting. And you write really beautifully about how, I don't have the exact quote in front of me, but how art metabolizes pain, and you're taking pain and trauma and sadness and melancholy and making something really beautiful out of it. And earlier you were talking about the kind of frivolity and excess and, you know, the dreaming and the whimsy of goth culture. So do you think that Black gothicness is ultimately healing? Can it be a healing force?
Oh, totally. Absolutely. First, it is that kind of taking all of whatever that negative feelings, that pain, the betrayal, the bitterness, the frustration, the fear, and taking all of that and putting it out and taking it out of yourself and putting it into something of your own creating, whether it's music or fashion or art or dance or whatever it is. And that's why I like the term metabolizing. It's taking something and changing it into something else for the good or for the better, or something that's kind of more nutritious, something that you can feed off of and grow from. You know, it's taking the negative and making it a positive, you know?
Yeah.
But aside from that, the whimsy and sort of the love of beauty and the appreciation of fantasy and the joy in horror, the fun in horror. Like people like horror movies because they're fun, you know?
Yep.
All of that stuff, I think it's just necessary for survival. I think you have to have those things. I think you have to have pleasure for the sake of pleasure and beauty for the sake of beauty and whimsy for the sake of whimsy. All of that stuff that makes you human and real and alive. That's why there's lots of memes and hashtags about Black joy, you know, and especially Black men, of like, you know, little videos of Black men just being goofy and silly and stupid, you know?
Yeah, I've seen that Black boy joy.
Yeah, because there's this idea that Black men are scary and serious and stoic. And that's dehumanizing to say that you're only this. You need joy to survive. How would you make it on a day-to-day basis if you didn't have something that made you laugh and smile and relax? And relax, for God's sake, and just do something because you think it's cool. You know?
Absolutely. Absolutely. Last question for you. I wish I could talk to you for 19 more hours. And honestly, I want to ask you about like every page of your book because it's so good. But I promise this is the last question. Recently, the Washington Post ran a story with the headline, "Do Elder Goths Hold the Secret to Aging Successfully?"
Yes.
So what do you make of that?
Goth never dies. It's like once you're a goth, you're always a goth. I think part of that is the holding on to sort of that kind of joyous, whimsical, silly, frivolous, romantic part of yourself and just keeping that alive in you. There was a quote in there that said the focus isn't about youth, which I really liked. It's more about a sensibility and a shared sensibility that doesn't really leave with age. Like you don't really grow out of your personality. I mean, I think it's why people look at like Edward Gorey as being like the grandfather of goth or something, you know, like that.
So much.
I know, me too. It's a subculture around a sentiment that's bigger than whatever the particular fashion is for that day. So I think because of that, like I don't go out as much as I used to. I don't really dress up as much as I used to. I still wear black pretty much every day, but
none of us are going out right now.
Right, exactly,
don't you worry.
True. Oh my God.
I take your point.
As soon as this thing is over, I'm fucking going to every goddamn goth bar and club and band every single night. I'm
Yes.
all my makeup. I'm wearing everything every single day.
Absolutely. Well, it was such a joy to speak with you. Thank you so much for being here. If people want to learn more about you, are you active online? How can people get on the Leila Taylor train?
I'm mostly on Twitter. Hello _ Leila or hello - Leila or something. One of those two. I forget. I should know. I never really actually pay attention to my own Twitter handle, but I would say that's probably the place where I'm most active online.
Awesome. And of course, they all must read your book, Darkly Black History and America's Gothic Soul. Leila, it was such a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you so much for being on the Witch Wave.
Thank you for having me. This is really great. This is really lovely.
That's it for the show. Thank you again to Leila Taylor for bearing her gothic soul and brilliant mind. Do you have questions, feedback, need some witchly advice, or just want to share something magical that happened to you recently? Go ahead and drop us an email at witchwavepodcast@gmail.com. We'd love to hear from you, and you just might make it on the Witchwire. The Witch Wave is produced, written, and recorded by me, Pam Grossman. This episode was edited by Rachel Jacobs, thank you Rachel, and myself. Our sound engineer was Josh Wilcox. Our theme music is the song Hand and I by Lycanthia. Special thanks go to Matt Freeman, Laura Antal, and Cece Pascal. You can check out information about this and other episodes on our website and now buy Witch Wave merch at witchwavepodcast.com. Please subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts and give us lots of sparkly stars. It really does make a difference and helps other people find the show. You can follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook at WitchWavePod, and you can check out my witch emoji for iPhone by going to witchemoji.com or downloading it in the App Store. Please consider picking up my book, Waking the Witch, which is available everywhere now. And if you want more Witch Wave or you just would like to support the show, please join us on Patreon. That's patreon.com/witchwave. Thank you so much for listening. Witches are the future. I'll catch you next time on The Witch Wave.